For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. For more information, visit faith.yale.edu.
True joy, being a real thinking person of faith, is not only realizing that the life that you may save might be your own, but it is also to know clearly that there is no divine justice that is not linked to social justice, and that the work of the gospel, the work of the church, the work of Christianity is the work of Jesus. It is the work of knowing that we can save souls without losing our minds or losing or lynching the lives of others in the process. Our work has to be not only salvific, but sane and life-saving.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. The novelist Alice Walker, known for her widely celebrated novel The Color Purple, once wrote, "There are those who believe Black people possess the secret of joy, and that it is this that will sustain them through any spiritual or moral or physical devastation." And our guest on the show today offers this definition of joy. Joy is the intrinsic capacity of Black people to bear yet sidestep the dynamics of their oppression. Thus, joy is the ultimate virtue in Black life, which is marked by resilience. Today, Ryan McAnnally-Linz interviews our friend and social ethicist, Stacey Floyd-Thomas. She is E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Chair and Associate Professor of Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University. She specializes in liberation theology and ethics, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, and postcolonial studies, not to mention ethical leadership and management. If you're interested in her perspectives that she shares in the show today, then I encourage you to learn more about womanist theory. And you can learn more about womanism over at Stacey Floyd-Thomas's new podcast, The Womanist Salon, a show that she just launched that explores and celebrates Black womanhood and the wisdom it offers. This episode comes in two parts. First, Ryan and Stacey discuss humility, not just as a virtue, but as a vice. You see, humility can go terribly wrong when it's held over the heads of those who are already humiliated, marginalized, and oppressed. So Stacey offers a womanist correction to humility. Second, they discuss Black joy, the ineliminable, resilient, beautiful Black joy, embodied in the privilege of Black folk wisdom and the fierce urgency of now that emerges from the common sense of a Black grandmother's kitchen, and the beauty and abundant life of Black joy. Now, if you're interested in these topics, specifically oppressive humility, as well as Black joy, then I would direct you to Stacey Floyd-Thomas's essay in a recent book that Ryan and I and our colleague Drew Collins published, The Joy of Humility, the beginning and end of the virtues. Now, if you're interested in this edited volume, which contains all sorts of perspectives from psychologists, philosophers, theologians, and ethicists, then check the show notes for a link to where you can purchase it. Thanks for listening today. Enjoy.
So, Stacey, thank you for taking some time to talk with us today. I wanted to, partly out of personal interest and just also because it seems like an important topic for our day, talk a little bit about humility. I wanted to start by asking what sort of worries you have about how Christians have understood and employed the claim that humility is a virtue. It's one of these kind of classic Christian virtues, but I take it you see some downsides to that, some problems, and I was hoping you could walk us through those a little bit.
Well, thanks for the invitation just to be in conversation with you, an ongoing conversation with you and the center. At the root of my critique, Ryan, is what good is humility for those who live in humble conditions or find themselves confronting humiliating circumstances day in and day out, right? So my observation is to put in stark relief the moral implications of how we employ language in assessing life conditions and virtue or vice for its viable assessment of what is good or just. We can even put it another way. If we say fasting, right, is a spiritual discipline as Christians, how is fasting useful for those who cannot find enough to eat? Do you see that very logic? And so I really love Toni Morrison because she reminds us that we should be leery of language that lures in weight of the bottom line for some, but it becomes bottomed out mindedness for others. Language and the ideas that give them power can privilege the powerful while simultaneously oppressing the other. Sexist language, racist language, theistic language, all are typical of policing languages of material realities, and they cannot or do not permit new knowledge, necessary visions, or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. But this is not mere wordplay, and for some, they might think that's the case. But when we're talking about religion, it literally holds life and salvation in its balance. So we cannot ignore the dialectical tensions between normative ephemeral notions that are produced by a kind of Western privilege, male-centered normativity up against the real life, real lived existential concerns embraced by those who live on the underside, those who live on the margins, or those who actually make up 2/3 of the world and the majority of American society. And so while humility makes sense as a virtue for those who know little about humble beginnings, but for those who have been continuously persecuted, oppressed, without, invisible, voiceless, silenced, or having been censored, they know humility all too well. And so for me, that's important for us to look at the language that we use around vice and virtue and the moral predicament that it can place certain people in.
So let me see if I'm following this. The critique is something that is a salutary spiritual recommendation, an actual virtue, when it's recommended to people in, say, a powerful, secure social location. If it's recommended in the same way, in the same tones, without any sort of contextual rearticulation to people in a humiliating, even oppressed social location, that's not going to be a virtue because it doesn't tend towards flourishing. Is that roughly the argument?
That is spot on. So, for instance, if we were to think about Aristotle's notion of proper pride, if we were to look at that within the American context, if the pride and flourishing of white people automatically ends up in translating to the disregard or disrespect of Black people, then white pride becomes a vice that makes the virtue of Black pride necessary. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, in normative understandings of virtue, that's a prideful statement. But the statement is being made because they have not mattered. And so the response to self-respect and just relationship normatively has been rejected as a proud statement. And the rejection of that statement in saying all lives matter actually is the vice of pride, which the response or critique is being projected against Black self-respect, which is to say Black Lives Matter means that Black people too are made in the image of God. It is not to say that white people don't matter. Let me give another example. I remember growing up in the 80s when people would say, why do we have a Black History Month? That seems unfair. We don't have a White History Month. No, the whole calendar belongs to white people. So do you see what I'm saying? So if you look at it through a solipsistic point of view, it would say, oh, how proud it is or how selfish it is to take ownership of an entire month, right? If you're going to look at it through that white solipsistic gaze, sure, that's what it seems like. But that is in the context of a world where the whole entire calendar belongs to white people. When I go into CVS, that's across the street from my school, and if I'm looking for hair care products for my daughter or myself on the way of, doing the quick stop on the way home, I am not going to find hair care products for my daughter and myself there, which means the students who are enrolled and matriculating at Vanderbilt, who are also African American, they're not going to find what they need there. The students who are Thai or who are Chinese or who are Sri Lankan, they can't go to Kroger and readily find all the ingredients to make up the dishes that nourish their palate, right? And so that in and of itself states that what is needed for your flourishing, what is needed for your day-to-day survival and maintenance does not matter. So in light of those few analogies, what I'm trying to say is that humility normatively is a disservice as a virtue. It actually is a sin. It's a vice, and it's a vice grip that normative Christian theology projects onto its majority representation of the ecumenism or the Christian fellowship of the church.
And so would I be right to take it that this kind of idea or pattern isn't strictly limited to humility and pride, but is a broader methodological sort of claim that virtues and vices aren't abstract universal things, but requires some sort of reading of context and social dynamics and patterns in order to make an assessment of what would be virtue and vice in this particular case, in this particular arrangement of life, rather than things that you can just identify in advance and then apply across the board. Is that right?
Absolutely. And not only virtue and vice in general, but evil in particular. So when we talk about evil versus good, right? What is evil? Evil is actually the misuse of the good, right? I mean, if we were to think about it, when we talk about the seven deadly sins or the seven vices or what Gandhi calls the moral blunders of the world, there is nothing wrong with pleasure. Pleasure is a gift from God. It is when pleasure is selfishly taken up to an obsessive point where it is not responsible, where it objectifies the other and in and of itself ends up dehumanizing the individual. That's where it gives itself over to evil. When we think about gluttony, whether we're talking about the gluttony of spirit, right? When we might be talking about prosperity gospel and thinking about the spiritual food of the word of God, or when we're actually talking about food itself. We need food for thought, food for the soul, and food for the body. But when we gorge off of it in a way in which we cannot appreciate it, in a way in which it just fattens us rather than sustains us, in the way we feed off of junk that might be full of in volume, but lack the nutrition for our well-being. That is how a good becomes evil and produces gluttony. So humility plays a key role for those whose norm and context is full of power and privilege. But it does nothing for those who are already humiliated and already existing in humble conditions.
It's like using the language of self-emptying that gets connected to humility through Philippians 2, where Christ's self-emptying is seen as a paradigm of humility.
Absolutely.
To empty oneself may very well be the good that is required of someone who's full, but to tell somebody who's empty would just be
foolish.
It would be not more than foolish. There would be something twisted about it, right?
Right. Absolutely. And just you giving that example reminds me of probably the best womanist philosophical lesson that I have ever received. It was my first year. I was coming home for Thanksgiving break as a first-year student at Vassar College. And we had a philosophy assignment where we were just supposed to practice on argumentation around a philosophical conundrum. And I was in the kitchen with my Nana, who was in town to visit from Selma, Alabama, and she was an exquisite cook. She was making biscuits. And I thought I was doing a great job just being in the kitchen with her, right? As a 18-year-old who wasn't interested much in an intergenerational conversation, but definitely who wanted to be fed from her fabulous cuisine. But I was taking up residence in the kitchen at the dining room table, working on my Apple IIce computer, that big honking thing that I had on the kitchen table, working on an assignment. So trying to engage me in grandmotherly banter, she said, "Well, what you working on, baby?" And I said, "Oh, Nana, just a paper I have to write for class." And she said, "What is it about?" And then I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And I was like, "Oh, Nana, just nothing, just an exercise. You wouldn't understand it." Now, my Nana was a brilliant woman, but obviously being the wife of a sharecropper, you could assume that she didn't have a college education. In fact, after having 14 children, she went back to school in her early 60s to get her GED. And so, and here I am at Vassar College, right, taking philosophy. So I wasn't even clear if she understood what philosophy was. I definitely wasn't interested in trying to explain it because I didn't full well know myself. And so I said, "Well, Nana," I said, "nothing, just a general exercise for a class." And she said, No. She said, "Well, indulge, Nana." And I said, "Oh, Nana." And she said, "Well, first of all, you should be here learning how to make biscuits from me. She said, "Because Nana's not going to always be here. And Nana doesn't have a recipe to write down. It's something you have to learn by practice and experience." And I said, "Well, Nana, I don't have time to learn how to make biscuits. And in fact, nobody can make biscuits like you do." Of course, I was blowing smoke and brown nosing there. And so I said, "But, I'm really pressed to do this." And she said, "You have one or two choices. Tell me what your assignment is about, or come here and make biscuits with me." And I said, "Okay, Nana." I said, "We're just doing a reflective philosophical exercise." I said, which is basically about the logic people use, how they think, how their mind works. And I said, and it's basically the question, is the glass half full or half empty? And she said, "Well, that's easy." I said, "No, Nana, it's not easy." I said that it's a kind of, conundrum. It's just an exercise. It has no answer. She says it does have an answer. I said, "Nana, it does." She said, "Listen, write this down, and then come up here and cook biscuits with me. I said, Nana, and she said, if something is being poured into the glass, it's half full. If something's being poured out, it's half empty. Write that down, wash your hands, and come to the counter.
Oh, man.
I did just that, and I got an A+ on the paper. And my professor ended up writing a journal article based on it. That is the epistemological privilege of the oppressed. It's the fierce urgency of now that King talks about that gives a kind of commonsensical, clear-minded, exacting, profound, critical engagement of what we just think about theoretically, but other people's lives depend upon it. What had scholars, right, or students wrestling, right, as an exercise was something that was just commonsensical to my Nana.
Yeah.
And when she was explaining that to me, I didn't have to repeat anything. And she had not stopped kneading the dough for the biscuits. It was that easy, that convenient, and that clear. And so that is why we need not only difference in bodies, but difference in perspectives. There's a way within our society when we're talking about language, when we're talking theologically, that we see difference as deficiency. But if we truly do believe that only when 2 or 3 are gathered, touching and agreeing, that the divine shows up. And that means that we cannot have any reflection or appreciation or apprehension of God outside of that diversity. So there's a way in which, if we can only know goodness in God in diversity, we can only necessarily tackle evil with that diversity as well, and thereby assure a sense of flourishing for ourselves as humans.
So I want to take a bit of a risk here and push in on something, because I heard you switch a little bit from an epistemological privilege that your Nana had to advocating for diversity. It seems to me that it would be possible to take the latter and kind of run with it without hearing the full weight of the former.
That's a poignant observation.
I want to ask, that epistemological privilege, kind of, what is it? Where does it come from? And what's the right stance to have when you recognize it?
Okay, so when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about the diversity that my Nana represents, not just diversity of opinion in general, right? So, because I do think that in order to have true dialogue, true community, and true communion, you don't have the right to remain silent, but you do have the right to be wrong, right? And you need to be humble enough in that, choosing humility towards those who have power and privilege and silence other people, that they need to be humble enough to hear a more exacting account of the truth. So diversity doesn't just mean different in this case. It means the difference from the norm. Because if the norm and the privileged position or power is producing the wrong result, then we need to look at the different factor that might make all of the difference in the way things are done. So it's not diversity for the sake of diversity. It is faith-seeking understanding and looking for the difference that is necessary to make one better understand what is good or what is evil.
I've heard you talk in the past a little bit about Black joy as central to the kind of moral understanding that you're looking to lift up and to draw attention to. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you mean by Black joy and how it interacts with this kind of contextual discernment of good and evil and virtue and vice in a really sort of fine-grained, down-to-earth kind of way.
Black joy, well, it's best represented in my mind from a song that's oftentimes sung in the Black church, that this joy that I have, the world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away. Doing the correction to the transliteration of the King James Version of Song of Songs 1, 5, and 6. King James Version says, "I'm Black but beautiful, O ye daughters of Jerusalem. Do not resent me or gaze upon me, because the sun has chosen to favorably shine upon me." But we know when we look at an appropriate transliteration and we see the newly revised standard version, actually the but was used to cancel out the and that was intended as a contextual reading of the scripture conveys. So in the NRSV version, we understand that passage to say, "I am Black and beautiful." Beauty, which is virtue, normatively understood. In Western notions, even in Christian traditions, has been the opposite of Blackness. So Black joy is to say that I too am made in the image of God. My life in its physicality and essence is good and not accidental, or nor should be therefore problematized. And I think a wonderful example of Black joy can clearly be seen when we look at African American women in the United States. And we've witnessed their movement from enslavement to emancipation and to the enfranchisement back to enslavement again, like with the feminization of poverty and the Moynihan 1965 report of everything dealing with Black poverty, or the cycle of poverty, is blamed upon Black women. And now with the enfranchisement again, that we see with the likes of Stacey Abrams, Latasha Brown, in doing everything to change the tide of the prospects of this yet to be United States, in securing the rights of Black people and saying that Black votes matter. And the agency of Black women matter. We see that you have Black women whom, for having a baby, I mean, even if you're Serena Williams, it can be a deadly activity because of the maternal mortality rate for Black women is 3 times higher than white women, or Black women remain the group most likely to be single or unmarried, or to not get breast cancer as often as white women, but to surely die of it once diagnosis has set in, more than any other group, works harder for the least amount of money. That yet these women at the same time have proven themselves to be the light, the vehicle of joy. I mean, for Stacey Abrams, as an example, to lose the governor's seat, and we can see a lot of unethical activity that took place in order to ensure that she would. But most people would go through all of the steps of grief and either become part of cancel culture. But instead of being defeated and conceding to, "I did not deserve to win," she used that instead to ignite her agency, to organize more, not for her own gain, but for people to realize that there was a problem with voter suppression in the United States. And that ended up, even when she was seen as a possible candidate from whom Joe Biden was considering as a VP pick, even when she was not chosen, that did not stop her resolve in working. It's very clear, I don't believe, that ticket might not have won. And it definitely was a difference in turning Georgia blue because of the joy, right? That might have actually come from not the vice of pride, but the virtue of pride. Not from a docile, passive love, but a love, to use Bev Harrison's words, that ignited from anger at an unjust system. And this is the kind of lesson that we miss in Christianity. The beauty of Stacey Abrams, besides the fact that we share the same name, of course, now that's a normatively prideful statement, but I actually went to seminary. I went to seminary with her parents, Carolyn Abrams and Robert Abrams. They were much older, and we were at Candler School of Theology. And I remember Stacey Abrams being a high school student when I was I was 21 as a seminarian, and the joy the entire family had, even though the children would be eating, dinner in the way of sandwiches as their parents were in study groups at school, and all of them piling into the car and, scrapping to make ends meet. But the joy that they felt to be able to be together, to study together, to be doing this work for not just the father, but the mother, especially, who was the Woodruff scholarship recipient. That was seen as their spiritual discipline. So her politics is akin to Aubrey Hendrick's notion of the politics of Jesus, that it's this kind of defiance and rather than passivity. Toni Morrison puts this way in The Bluest Eye, where she's talking about two little girls who are trying to stand in defense of their friend who has been humiliated and abused, and believes that the only way she can have self-regard or beauty is if, as a Black girl, she had blue eyes. And these two girls, I think, represent Black joy. Morrison quotes them as saying, "We had defended ourselves since memory against everybody and everything. We considered all speech a code to be broken by us, and all gestures subject to careful analysis. We had become headstrong, devious, and arrogant. Nobody paid us any attention. So we paid very good attention to ourselves. Our limitations were not known to us, not then." And that "not then," that ellipsis is important, because if someone allows their Christian development, their identity development, their flourishing to be charted by a gaze that is antithetical to their embodiment, they become incarnate evil rather than incarnate good. So taking oneself seriously when no one else has paid you any attention is a virtue, which makes humility a vice. And so that joy is what womanists call, and that I've named, the four tenets of womanism being radical subjectivity, traditional communalism, redemptive self-love, and critical engagement. Or, as Morrison's outlining here, being headstrong, traditionally devious or subversive, arrogant enough to believe that you are somebody, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and to do careful analysis, which is that critical engagement. And that's the joy of Black women. It's the joy not only of Black women in America today who take up these tenets, or the ones that I've outlined from my Nana to Stacey Abrams, but it is the joy of the women in the Christian extensive narrative, many of them that have no names, many of them that do have names, right? Whether we're talking about Mary in the Bible, where she is at her girlfriend's wedding party, and her girlfriend is about to be humiliated because they've run out of wine. And any woman who knows about hospitality and saving face knows that when you can no longer serve your guests, that you failed in your job of being a host. And she goes to her son. She goes to Jesus and says, I need you to turn this water into wine. And what does Jesus say? Nope. It's not my time. What does she do? She doesn't even engage him. She turns to the servants and says to them, do what he says. She activates because of the arrogance and the assistance to save her friend's face. She's radically subjective. She's traditionally communal. She critically engaged, and she redeems the self-love of what it means to be a woman and provide hospitality. And she enacts the power that Jesus assumes he doesn't have. The exact same thing with Mary and Martha. They arrogantly, with radical subjectivity, taking themselves seriously and being headstrong, they encounter Jesus. When he's away from home, they encounter Jesus, who they have supported, who they've taken in as an extension of their family, and said, where have you been? Lazarus, our brother, your supposed beloved brother, is dead, and you failed. And it's because of their insistence and their anger and despair that Jesus weeps. And then he raises Lazarus from the dead. And we don't know if he's weeping because they're angry, if he's weeping because of what happened to Lazarus, or if he's weeping because of their lack of faith. But it was their engagement of Jesus that makes Jesus weep, right? Or we can look at the woman with the issue of blood. Society tells her she's unclean. Society tells her she should be shut in. We probably know now, given science, that she had probably endometriosis. She was suffering year in, year out, as many women do, with fibroids that have gone out of whack. And so she was supposed to shelter in place. She was supposed to keep herself at social distance, lest other people would be offended by her stench and the uncleanliness of what is absolutely natural to a woman's being. And she hears the rumor of this Messiah who was in town, who has been doing all of these wonderful things. And she takes herself seriously, presses her way into the crowd, and touches the hem of his garment. She does not engage Jesus at all. Jesus says, who touched me? Because I felt power leave out of my body. She was not touching nor figuring she could tap in on the HIM of Jesus. She knew she had no place because the patriarchy his embodiment represented said hands off. She was touching the HEM. She was touching, it was her faith, right? That said, if I can just get there. The Syrophoenician woman, right? Whose daughter was vexed by the devil, right? Who other gospels identify as the Canaanite woman, right? And we know that the Canaanite people were darker people. Noah curses Ham's descendants of Canaan to always be subject to the oppression of the other brothers, because he rightfully said, Daddy, you're drunk and naked. But that's another podcast and another conversation.
That is a different can of worms.
Right. So the Syrophoenician woman goes to Jesus on his second holiday. The disciples are telling her to get away, right? And she says to Jesus, my daughter is vexed by the devil. And Jesus says, I am not here for you, but for the house of Israel. And she says, uh-huh. And then he said, it's not fair for the dogs to eat at the master's table. Jesus, in fact, calls her a dog. He lets her know what the stereotype, what the statistics say, what the contextual read, what the normative gaze is of this woman who is out of place, out of time, and out of her mind in making a petition of Jesus. And when he says that, she says, okay, true, but I need help for my daughter, and even dogs get to eat crumbs. And when she says that, Jesus says, great is your faith. Let it be unto you even as thou wilt. And there's several stories like that in Jesus's encounter. The woman with the alabaster jar, just several. But anytime Jesus or the disciples encounter a man with a problem, the man at the gate beautiful, the man whose son was falling in the fire, in the water, I believe, help my disbelief. There was always some huge exchange, some huge philosophical account, right? Like the paper I was trying to write. Right? The women were more like my Nana. Just, get it and move on. Yeah, yep. Because you have so many things to do. Life is held in the balance. This is not some, Nicodemus exchange. Right? This is not the man who's at the gate beautiful for 38 years. It's just, he's continuously talking about what people did to him and how, it's like, do you want to be well or not? Jesus has to engage in philosophical banter, debate, pleading of men in the text, men who I guess are entitled in some ways to the miracles Jesus is to give. But the women, unnamed, the women who gave life and the women who were there when his life was taken by state-sanctioned lynching and violence, the women don't engage in the philosophical banter. They insist with pride in the name of love that something has to change. And so what others might call sinful or viceful in being out of place is actually the correct use of love, is actually filling the glass that is empty.
We've got listeners coming from a bunch of different social locations. And I wonder if you'd have any closing advice for them, in all of those kind of differences of location, for discerning the implications of Jesus' life and ministry and these kind of interactions that we see in the scriptural text that you were just talking about, for how they ought to live. Given that it's not on your account, just like finding the list of virtues and then going after them, but a really fine-grained, hard analysis, difficult sort of contextual thing to do, to read the situation with the care that it's due. Given all of that, how do you start discerning?
To be clear, obviously I'm coming from my social location as a Black woman. I've given examples of many Black women, but I am not saying that to know joy or to know Jesus or to know the good, one has to be a Black woman. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that to know true joy and to know good, one must view the objectification of others as sinful and as a vice. And that is what Jesus did. It has been accepted as evangelical parlance and universalized way of living to ask the question, what would Jesus do? And what did Jesus do? Jesus was always doing the work of setting the oppressed free, of giving sight to the blind, of giving food rather than insisting on the fast of those who were hungry, of calling everybody to accountability when people only see sin from one perspective, and saying, let's use the act of grace in knowing that those without sin do not exist. To know joy is to be certain in one's thinking, doing, and being that your joy does not exact oppression from another. Rather, that your joy brings joy and abundant life to all who have engaged you, no matter where you are on the road to salvation. True joy, being a real thinking person of faith, is not only realizing that the life that you may save might be your own, but it is also to know clearly that there is no divine justice that is not linked to social justice, and that the work of the gospel, the work of the church, the work of Christianity is the work of Jesus. It is the work of knowing that we can save souls without losing our minds or losing or lynching the lives of others in the process. Our work has to be not only salvific, but sane and life-saving.
Well, Stacey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been a real joy.
I always enjoy it. Thank you so much.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured social ethicist Stacey Floyd-Thomas and theologian Ryan McAnnally-Linz. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edited and produced the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. We produce a new episode every Saturday, and you can subscribe through any podcast app. We're grateful that you're listening to this podcast. We're passionate about making this work consistently accessible to people who are genuinely concerned about the viability of faith in a world racked with division, contested views about what it means to be human, and what it means to live life well. If you're in a position to support our show financially and are looking for some year-end opportunities, please consider partnering with us. We rely on the generosity of individuals like you to make our work possible. And if you're not, please continue listening and engaging the content. Let us know what you're interested in. We're grateful that you're listening. But if you can give, if you're truly passionate about supporting podcasting that's all about pursuing, really living lives that are worthy of our humanity, then consider a gift to the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit faith.yale.edu/give. or find the link in the show notes to make a year-end contribution. It's our joy to bring these shows to you, and we'd invite you to bring that same joy in supporting this work. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with more next week.